The parking garage was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your ears tune into every sound, a faint hum of fluorescent lights above, the distant click of a car door closing somewhere, and the echo of footsteps soft, steady, and deliberate. It was the sort of silence that stretched like a thin sheet of glass, ready to crack at the slightest touch. Emily Walker's footsteps were the only ones that mattered for now. Her shoes clicked against the concrete, the sound bouncing off the walls like whispers. To anyone else, it was just an ordinary Tuesday night. People came and went, rushing to their cars, lost in their own little worlds. For Emily, though, something about this night felt different. Not in an obvious way, no dramatic storm outside, no strange warning signs, but in her gut, a quiet instinct stirred. Her instinct had never failed her before. Emily wasn't the kind of woman who drew attention. That was her greatest strength. She didn't stride into rooms and demand to be noticed. She wasn't the loud, flashy type who seemed to exist for the spotlight. Instead, she blended in, moved quietly, and let people's assumptions work in her favor. People saw what they wanted to see when they looked at her, a quiet woman, maybe shy, maybe harmless. The truth was far more complicated. Dressed in jeans, a plain gray hoodie, and sneakers, Emily looked like any other young woman leaving late from work or running errands. Her black hair was tied into a neat ponytail, and her bag hung lightly over her shoulder. She moved with purpose, though, every step deliberate and measured. There was no rush in her movements, no fear, no hesitation, just calm control. If someone had been watching closely, they might have noticed something different about the way she carried herself. Her posture was straight but relaxed, her shoulders slightly squared. Her head stayed high, eyes alert without being obvious. She didn't slouch or fidget. It was the kind of calm that comes only when you know you can handle whatever comes next. And tonight, something was coming. The garage was a dimly lit maze of gray concrete and cold metal. The rows of parked cars created shadows, pockets of darkness where anything or anyone could hide. The only signs of life came from the flickering fluorescent lights above, some buzzing faintly, others flickering like they were on their last breath. Emily took it all in without missing a step. She noticed everything: the two cars parked farther back that hadn't been there when she arrived earlier, the abandoned soda can rolling slightly across the floor, and most importantly the faint sound of low voices that seemed just a little too close. She didn't stop walking, didn't even flinch, but her senses sharpened. Years of experience had trained her to recognize these subtle signals, things most people ignored, like footsteps matching yours from too far behind or a laugh that didn't sound quite natural. Emily was used to being underestimated. Most of her life, people had looked at her and assumed she wasn't much of a threat. She was small, quiet, and didn't say more than she had to. That was fine with her. It was better that way. People who underestimated her were always surprised when they found out the truth, though not all of them got the chance to regret it. A soft echo came from the far corner of the garage, followed by the sound of something metallic clanging briefly against the floor. Emily's eyes flickered toward the source of the noise, but she didn't turn her head. If someone was trying to get her attention, she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Instead, she slowed her breathing, staying calm, steady. Her fingers rested lightly on the strap of her bag. It was strange how quiet the garage felt now, as if everything had stilled. Even the hum of the lights seemed farther away. The only sound left was her footsteps and the growing suspicion that she wasn't alone. When Emily rounded the next corner, she finally saw them, three men leaning casually against a pair of motorcycles near the far exit. At first glance, they seemed like any other group of bikers: leather jackets, boots scuffed with dust, and hands stuffed into their pockets like they owned the place. The men were laughing softly, exchanging words she couldn't hear, but it was clear that she was their new focus. One of them turned his head slightly as she appeared, his eyes narrowing. Emily didn't react. She just kept walking, her pace neither speeding up nor slowing down. It was the same pace she'd had since she entered the garage, steady and quiet. She wasn't close enough yet to hear their conversation, but it didn't matter. She could feel the weight of their attention on her, pressing against the air like invisible hands. "Looks like we've got company," one of the men said, loud enough for her to hear this time. His voice was gruff, casual, but there was something else behind it, a hint of challenge, of testing. Another man chuckled, shifting his stance as he turned fully to face her. "Hey, sweetheart," he called out, drawing the word out in a way that turned it sour. "Where's the fire? You in a hurry?" Emily kept walking. She was close enough now to see them more clearly. The man who'd spoken first was tall and broad, his arms crossed over his chest. His leather jacket looked worn, and a patch on the sleeve suggested he was part of a local biker club, not that it mattered to her. The second man, shorter but stocky, had a smirk plastered across his face, like he thought he'd already won some kind of game. The third man, standing slightly apart, didn't say anything, but his eyes followed her carefully. Emily said nothing. She didn't look at them, didn't give them any acknowledgement. "Oh, come on now," the shorter man called out, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Don't be rude. We're just saying hi." Her car was parked only a few rows down now. She could see it, her small silver sedan sitting quietly under the dull glow of a light. But Emily didn't relax. She didn't let herself think about how close she was to leaving. The space between her and the bikers still felt heavy, as if the air itself didn't want to move. "Maybe she's shy," the taller man said, his voice lower now, almost as though he was talking to himself but loud enough for her to hear. "Or maybe, she's just not very friendly." Emily still said nothing. They were testing her, baiting her. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and she knew exactly what they wanted, a reaction. It was always the same story. Men like this, loud, arrogant, and overconfident, thought they could control any situation. They saw someone like Emily, someone quiet and small, and they thought she would be afraid. And if she wasn't? Well, that made them angry. Emily reached into her hoodie pocket, her fingers brushing against a familiar object. It wasn't much, just a small, well-worn keychain attached to her car keys. But it wasn't the keys she was paying attention to. It was the other small item attached to the ring. She still didn't look at them as she passed. Her pace never changed, but inside, her focus sharpened like the edge of a blade. She knew what they thought of her. To them, she was just some quiet woman walking alone in a parking garage. Easy to scare, easy to control. They didn't know the truth. Emily reached her car door, her fingers wrapping lightly around the handle as the men watched. "Where you headed, sweetheart?" one of them called out again. Still, she said nothing. She opened the door and paused. It wasn't hesitation, just a moment of stillness, as if she were listening for something no one else could hear. Then, slowly, she turned her head just enough to glance back at them over her shoulder. It was the first time she'd looked at them since walking in, and something in her expression must have been different because the smirk on the shorter man's face faltered. Emily's eyes held steady. Calm. Unshaken. And for just a moment, barely long enough for them to register it, they caught a glimpse of the truth. She wasn't afraid. Emily's gaze lingered for only a heartbeat, a calm but unmistakable look, one that wasn't defiance or bravado but a quiet warning. Most people wouldn't notice it, but these men had spent enough time around trouble to recognize when something felt off. Still, arrogance always has a way of burying instinct. "Hey." The shorter man pushed himself off his bike and took a step toward her. His voice had lost some of the playful mockery. "I'm talking to you." Emily turned her head away and slipped into her car. The door closed with a soft but deliberate click. She didn't rush to start the engine, though, her hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, her fingers unmoving. Her reflection in the rearview mirror was as calm as it had been since she entered the garage. Behind her, the men were still watching. The shorter man frowned, clearly irritated. "Who does she think she is?" he muttered, kicking at the base of his bike. "Stuck up little." "Relax," the taller one said with a low chuckle. He sounded amused, but there was a tension in his tone now, like he was trying to reassure himself as much as the others. "She's just playing hard to get. Give her a minute. We'll get her attention." Emily could hear them faintly through her closed windows, but she didn't react. She sat there, still as a statue, staring straight ahead. Then she glanced briefly at the small object hanging from her keychain. It wasn't flashy or impressive to look at, just a tiny metal tag with a single symbol etched into it. To most, it was meaningless. But to the people who knew what that symbol meant, it was something far more important, a quiet signature of someone not to be trifled with. The tag was worn from years of use, its edges smooth, the grooves of the design darkened with time. Emily allowed herself the smallest of smiles as her thumb brushed over it. Outside the car, the men were growing restless. The taller one took another step forward, his boots scuffing loudly against the concrete floor. His voice was low and deliberate this time. "Hey, lady. We're not gonna hurt you. Just trying to be friendly here." There it was, that tone. The one where men like him thought they could control a situation by pretending they were harmless, all while making sure the threat still lingered between the lines. Emily had seen it before. Too many times to count. Her calm didn't waver. She shifted her bag slightly, placing it in the passenger seat, and reached for her phone. Not to call anyone, though that wasn't her plan. Instead, she pulled up the front-facing camera, angling the phone just enough to get a view of what was happening behind her. The shorter man was pacing now, his steps uneven, his frustration clear. "I don't like this," he grumbled. "She's just sitting there." The taller one shot him a glare. "What's the problem?" "She's not going anywhere." The third man, the quiet one, hadn't moved. His eyes were locked on Emily's car, and for the first time, something flickered across his face: uncertainty. He took a step forward and muttered something under his breath, too quiet for the others to hear. The taller man ignored him and reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a cigarette and lit it with a flick of his lighter, the small flame glowing briefly in the dim garage. He inhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing as smoke curled up toward the buzzing lights. "Let's just go over there and talk to her," he said finally, blowing out the smoke in a slow stream. "She'll come around." The shorter man hesitated. "What if?" "What if what?" The taller man turned on him sharply, his voice hard. "You scared of one little girl?" The shorter man's jaw tightened, and his eyes darted toward Emily's car. He didn't say anything. Meanwhile, Emily waited. Her breathing was still slow, her heart steady. To someone watching from the outside, she might have looked frozen like a deer caught in headlights. But inside, Emily's mind was calculating, running through options with the kind of precision that only comes from years of practice. She could leave. Start the car, back out, and drive away. It was the simplest option, and they wouldn't be able to stop her in time. But something about this moment made her pause. These men, arrogant, loud, and careless, thought they were in control of the situation. They weren't. She tilted her phone slightly, zooming in on the reflection of the taller man's face. It was partially obscured by smoke, but she got what she needed. One clear shot. Then, slowly, Emily lowered the phone and slipped it back into her bag. Outside, the taller man motioned toward her car. "Come on," he said, his voice filled with the kind of forced confidence that didn't quite hide the edge of irritation beneath it. "Let's see what her problem is." The shorter man hesitated again, glancing nervously toward the third man, the quiet one who still hadn't moved. "What do you think?" he muttered. The third man didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed on Emily's car, his brow furrowed, as though he was trying to put something together that he couldn't quite grasp. The taller man didn't wait. He started walking, his boots hitting the concrete with heavy, deliberate steps that echoed through the garage. The shorter man cursed under his breath and followed, leaving their motorcycles behind. The third man remained where he was, watching. Inside the car, Emily's grip tightened slightly around the keychain. Her reflection in the rearview mirror stared back at her calm, unshaken. She could see the two men approaching behind her now. Their movements weren't fast, they weren't running or charging. Instead, they walked slowly, like predators sizing up prey. But Emily wasn't prey. The taller man reached the back of her car first, his figure silhouetted in the dim light. He stopped there, as if waiting for her to react, but Emily didn't move. "Hey," he said again, his voice softer this time but with no less arrogance. "We just want to talk." The shorter man flanked him, his expression uneasy. "Lady, you don't need to be so rude. We're just trying to be nice." Emily's expression didn't change. She waited a moment longer before her hand moved to the car door handle. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed the door open. It wasn't sudden or forceful, just calm and controlled. The door swung wide, the creak of the hinge cutting through the silence. The taller man's smirk widened, though there was something else in his eyes now, something wary. "That's better," he said. "No need to." Emily stepped out of the car. For a moment, the men froze. It wasn't what she did, it was how she did it. She moved with the kind of quiet authority that demanded attention without saying a word. Her posture was straight, her shoulders square, her face expressionless. There was no fear in her movements, no hesitation, just quiet confidence. And for the first time, the taller man hesitated. Emily closed the car door behind her, the sound echoing through the garage. She turned to face them fully now, her eyes meeting theirs for the first time. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "What do you want?" she asked softly. The taller man blinked, clearly caught off guard by her calm tone. "We're just trying to be friendly," he said after a pause, though his voice wasn't as smooth as before. Emily didn't respond. She just watched him. Silence stretched between them. The shorter man shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his companion. "Maybe we should." "Shut up," the taller man snapped, though his voice had lost some of its edge. He looked back at Emily, forcing a smirk. "Why don't you relax? No need to act all tough." Emily tilted her head slightly, as though considering his words. Then she spoke again, her voice quiet but firm. "I think you should leave." The taller man laughed, though it sounded forced. "Or what?" Emily didn't answer. But the way she looked at him, the quiet, unwavering confidence in her eyes said everything. And for the first time, the taller man felt it. A flicker of doubt. Something about this woman wasn't right. The parking garage was too quiet now, its usual hum of distant cars and flickering lights replaced by a stillness that felt deliberate. Emily Walker didn't like deliberate silence. It usually meant someone or something was waiting. She ignored the shiver crawling up her spine and reached for her car door, moving as though she hadn't noticed the figures leaning against their motorcycles in the far corner. But she had noticed. There were 3 of them. They weren't trying to hide, in fact, they looked like they wanted to be seen. Their bikes, gleaming chrome with black and red detailing, sat parked in a perfect line, like soldiers standing at attention. Each one of the men leaned against his bike with casual arrogance, as if they owned the space. The one in the middle stood out most of all. Tall and broad-shouldered, he wore a leather jacket with patches sewn across it, symbols Emily didn't recognize, but she could guess their meaning. Territory. Loyalty. A history of trouble. His dark hair was slicked back, and his jaw was sharp, his lips curled in a permanent smirk. It was the kind of expression that said he was used to getting what he wanted. Beside him, the man on the left was shorter and wiry, his hands restless as they drummed against his knee. He had a sharp face, pointed like a knife, and his eyes darted around the garage like he was looking for something or someone. The last man, on the right, was quieter. Stockier, older. His head was shaved, and a thick scar ran across his brow, disappearing into the corner of his eye. He didn't move much, but the way his arms were crossed over his chest made him look immovable, like a wall of stone. They saw Emily the moment she stepped out of the elevator. And now they were waiting. She could feel their eyes on her as she walked across the concrete floor, the sound of her heels echoing too loudly. She forced herself to move slowly, deliberately. Nothing about her stride revealed tension or fear. At least, that's what she hoped they saw. "Hey, sweetheart." The voice came from the tall one. Smooth, dripping with mockery. It broke the silence with an edge that made the word sweetheart sound like an insult. Emily kept walking, pretending not to hear. She reached her car and placed her hand on the door handle. "You lost." The voice was louder this time. Closer. The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, bouncing off the concrete walls. Emily's fingers froze on the handle for half a second too long before she pulled the door open with what she hoped looked like calm indifference. But the men noticed everything. Not even a hello. The tall one pushed himself off his bike, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud. He started walking toward her, his hands stuffed casually into the pockets of his jacket. The wiry man followed a step behind him, still drumming his fingers against his jeans. The third man stayed back, but his eyes never left Emily. Emily slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel with both hands, her knuckles pale against the black leather. She kept her expression neutral, her movements slow. She reached for the door to pull it closed. But a boot blocked the way. The tall man stood there now, his leg casually wedged in the doorframe. He smiled a cold, predatory smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Whoa, whoa, easy there," he said, shaking his head as if scolding a child. "No need to run off so quick. We're just trying to be friendly." Emily's pulse quickened, but her face remained impassive. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time. "I'm not interested," she said softly. Her voice was even, calm. The man's grin widened. "Oh, come on. Don't be like that." He leaned slightly closer, his hands still buried in his pockets. "A little conversation never hurt anyone, right?" "Yeah," the wiry man chimed in from behind him, his voice high and sharp. "We're just talking. No reason to get all tense." Emily glanced at the man's foot, still blocking her door, then back up at the tall one. Her calm didn't falter, but there was an unmistakable steeliness in her gaze now. "Move your foot." For a moment, the tall man seemed surprised, like he hadn't expected her to talk back. Then his smirk returned, but there was something else behind it now, a flicker of irritation. He tilted his head slightly, as though sizing her up. "You got some nerve, lady," he said slowly, drawing out each word. Emily didn't respond. She just kept looking at him, her expression unchanging. The wiry man let out a loud, barking laugh. "Look at her. Acting like she's in charge." He nudged the tall man's arm. "What do you think, Reese? You gonna let her talk to you like that?" Reese. So that was the tall one's name. Reese didn't move. He stayed where he was, his gaze locked with Emily's. For a moment, the two of them stared at each other in silence. It felt like the air in the garage had gone thin. Finally, Reese chuckled softly. He took a step back and removed his boot from the door. "Suit yourself," he said, his voice light but laced with something darker. "Didn't mean to scare you." Emily didn't hesitate. She pulled the door shut with a sharp thunk and locked it. The sound of the lock clicking into place was loud in the stillness. Reese didn't walk away. Neither did the wiry man. They stood there, watching her through the window, their expressions unreadable. The wiry man's smile twitched at the edges, like he was struggling to contain his amusement. Reese, on the other hand, looked calm, too calm. Emily turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the headlights flashed across the garage. Reese took a step to the side, out of the beams of light, but he didn't leave. Instead, he leaned slightly closer to the glass, his face partially obscured by shadows. His voice carried over the sound of the engine. "Drive safe, sweetheart." The words sounded friendly, but the way he said them made Emily's stomach twist. She didn't wait. She gripped the gear shift, reversed out of the parking spot, and pulled away. Her tires squealed slightly against the concrete, the sound echoing behind her as she sped toward the exit. In the rearview mirror, she saw them. Reese and his friend were still standing there, their figures framed by the dim, buzzing lights. The third man, the silent one, hadn't moved, but he was watching her car, his eyes following her as she disappeared around the corner. Emily's hands were steady on the wheel, but her mind was racing. She replayed the encounter in her head, analyzing each word, each movement. Those men weren't just trying to scare her, they were testing her. Pushing to see how far they could go. And something told her they weren't done yet. As she reached the garage's exit, she slowed just enough to punch in her parking ticket. The machine beeped, the barrier arm lifted, and Emily pulled onto the empty street. She didn't look back. But in her mind, she could still see them. And she knew this wasn't over. As Emily's car sped onto the empty street, the hum of the engine was the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. The city around her was dark, peppered with only a few glowing windows and scattered streetlights. Her hands stayed firm on the wheel, her knuckles barely bending, her face unreadable. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. But her mind was sharp, replaying the details. Reese. That was his name. He was the ringleader, the one who seemed most confident, the type of man who had pushed his way through life, bullying and breaking whatever stood in his path. The wiry man? He was a follower, a shadow that moved wherever Reese pointed him. The third man, the quiet one with the scar. He hadn't spoken. He didn't need to. Emily knew from experience that men like him were always the most dangerous. She knew their type all too well. The street lights rolled past, one after the other, washing the car in orange flashes as she drove. Every few seconds, she glanced in the rearview mirror. Empty road. No headlights. No bikes. Not yet. Reaching a red light, Emily slowed to a stop, letting out a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her pulse was steady, but the tension in her shoulders lingered. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel for just a moment, eyes closed, letting herself think. What were they doing there? Bikers didn't usually linger in empty parking garages unless they were waiting for something or someone. They hadn't seemed surprised to see her. If anything, they looked like they had been expecting her. That thought made her uneasy. She wasn't being paranoid. Emily had spent too many years learning how to trust her instincts. Instincts had kept her alive before, and she wasn't about to start ignoring them now. The light turned green. She pressed on the gas and eased the car forward, her eyes scanning the streets, searching for movement. The streets remained silent. Nothing but darkness and the occasional flicker of neon signs. Still, something didn't sit right. She adjusted the mirror slightly, her eyes darting across the glass. Empty street, empty street. Then, in the distance, she saw them. Two pairs of headlights. Small at first, but growing brighter by the second. Bikes. Emily exhaled through her nose, her jaw tightening. She wasn't surprised. If anything, she was prepared. Part of her had been waiting for this moment the entire time. "Fine," she muttered under her breath, her hands shifting their grip on the wheel. "Let's see what you're planning." The two motorcycles appeared closer now, their low engines cutting through the silence of the night. They weren't speeding, they weren't even trying to catch up yet. Instead, they lingered a few car lengths behind, just close enough for Emily to see their silhouettes in her rearview mirror. Reese was on one of them. She couldn't see his face in the dark, but she knew. She didn't panic. She didn't floor the gas pedal or make any sudden movements. Instead, she maintained her speed, weaving naturally with the flow of the empty road. Her expression stayed blank, calm. The bikes matched her every move. Emily's thumb tapped against the steering wheel as she thought. What do they want? They were testing her, toying with her like cats circling a mouse. That's what people like them did, they pushed limits, calculated reactions. But she wasn't a mouse. A sharp corner approached, marked by a street sign pointing toward an industrial area. Empty warehouses, forgotten lots, places nobody would be lurking at this time of night. Emily's gaze lingered on the sign for just a second before she made her decision. She turned sharply. The tires gripped the road as the car curved around the corner, disappearing from the biker's line of sight for half a second. That was all she needed. Emily hit the brakes. The car screeched to a sudden stop, its headlights cutting through the darkness and illuminating the cracked pavement ahead. She slid into neutral and killed the engine. The hum of the motor faded to nothing. Silence swallowed the street whole. She waited. Seconds ticked by, stretching longer with every breath. She kept her gaze fixed on her mirrors, listening. Then she heard them, the bikes. Their growling engines echoed as they approached, drawing closer to the corner. Closer. Closer. And then, two motorcycles shot past the turn, their headlights streaking like comets through the night. They didn't see her. Emily let out a slow, measured breath, her body perfectly still. She watched as the bikes sped further down the road, their tail lights shrinking until they vanished completely. Her hands flexed around the steering wheel, loosening the tightness she hadn't realized had built up. They thought they were clever, she thought to herself, shaking her head slightly. They're not. Still, she didn't start the car right away. Instead, she waited. Because if there was one thing Emily knew about people like Reese, it was this: they didn't give up. She was right. It wasn't even a full minute later when she saw two pinpricks of light in the distance, looping back toward the corner. They were coming back. Emily started the engine with a quiet hum. No sudden movements. No panic. As the bikes approached again, their headlights cutting through the dark, Emily calmly shifted into drive and rolled forward. She kept her speed low, controlled, letting the shadows swallow her as she turned onto another road. Behind her, the bikes appeared again. This time, they weren't holding back. The low growl of their engines grew louder, sharper, as they sped toward her car. Emily didn't look back anymore. She didn't need to. She could hear them. The chase had begun. Emily's eyes darted across the road ahead, scanning the layout. The industrial area sprawled out in front of her like a maze, rows of warehouses, locked gates, and half-finished construction sites. She knew it would work to her advantage. They might have had the bikes, but she had the brains. Her foot pressed harder on the gas. The car surged forward, its headlights spilling over the cracked pavement. The engine growled in response, as if matching her determination. Behind her, the bikers followed. She could hear their engines roaring in her ears, relentless. The road split into two paths ahead, left or right. Emily chose left, the sharper turn. Her tires screeched, but she controlled it, hugging the curve perfectly. She glanced at her mirrors again. The bikers followed, but one of them, Reese, she guessed was closer now, his figure silhouetted against his headlights. They're getting too close. Emily's jaw tightened. Fine. She'd give them a reason to back off. Her eyes flicked toward the dark outline of a warehouse up ahead, large, empty, its gates hanging half open. Without hesitation, she veered toward it. The car lurched as it hit the uneven ground, sending gravel flying beneath the wheels. The bikers followed, though she could hear one of them curse as the terrain became rougher. Good. Emily spotted an open loading bay to the left and made her move. She slammed the brakes, throwing the car into reverse. The engine growled in protest, but she ignored it, maneuvering quickly. The bikers hadn't expected it. One of them sped past, unable to stop in time. The other swerved hard to avoid her, his tires skidding dangerously across the gravel. Emily shifted back into drive and shot forward again, the sudden movement sending a spray of dirt and dust into the air behind her. It worked. She had gained a few precious seconds. As she sped toward the other side of the warehouse, her mind was calculating, cold and clear. She couldn't keep this up forever, not here. She needed an advantage, a place where bikes couldn't follow. Her gaze caught something ahead, an old, narrow access road, barely visible under overgrown brush and crumbling pavement. It looked abandoned. Perfect. Without hesitating, she turned onto it, the car bumping over the uneven surface. Branches scratched against the sides, but she didn't slow down. She could hear the bikers roaring behind her, but their engines sounded more distant now, strained by the rough terrain. The road twisted sharply again, leading toward a steep incline. Emily's breath steadied as she took it, her hands firm on the wheel. This was it. If they followed her here, they'd regret it. And she'd make sure of that. The air in the parking garage was cold, thick with tension, as Emily Walker stood in front of her car. The bikers circled closer now, their heavy boots echoing against the concrete floor. Each step sounded deliberate, like a predator closing in on prey. "Where you off to in such a hurry, sweetheart?" one of them sneered. His voice dripped with mockery. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a leather vest that looked worn from years of use. Reese. Emily already knew his type, the kind of man who thrived on intimidation. Beside him, another man let out a low laugh, leaning lazily against his motorcycle. He was wiry, his grin sharp like broken glass. He didn't say much, but his eyes danced with amusement, like he was watching some private joke unfold. The third man, though, was different. Scar. That's what Emily decided to call him. His face was marked with a jagged line running from his temple to his chin. He hadn't laughed or spoken. Instead, he stood back, arms crossed over his chest, watching her like a hawk. The quiet ones always watched the hardest. Emily sighed softly, almost too softly to hear, as she unlocked her car. The faint beep of the doors echoed through the empty garage, startlingly loud in the silence. Her fingers grazed the edge of her phone, tucked securely in her jacket pocket, but she didn't pull it out. There was no need. "You deaf or just rude?" Reese asked again, stepping forward. The sound of his boots scraped across the ground, deliberate and grating. Emily didn't look at him. She kept her movements steady, calm, as though she had all the time in the world. She slid her bag onto the passenger seat, her back to them. She heard their low laughter ripple behind her like a wave. "Hey!" Reese barked, sharper this time. Emily straightened slowly. Her movements were smooth, deliberate. She turned to face them, her expression unreadable. Her eyes flicked over each of them briefly, just enough for them to notice the steady calm behind her gaze. "You have 3 seconds to back away," she said softly. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't even forceful. But it landed sharp and unexpected, like a knife suddenly pressed to the skin. Reese's brows shot up. Then, as though on cue, the others burst into laughter. 3 seconds, the wiry one cackled. "Oh no, guys, did you hear that? She's counting." Reese smirked and tilted his head, clearly entertained. 3 seconds, huh? And what happens if we don't? Emily held his gaze, unflinching. 1. Reese's smirk faltered slightly, though he didn't move. 2. Scar shifted, his eyes narrowing just a little, but he stayed silent. 3. And that's when it happened. In one smooth motion, Emily reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, metallic device. Before any of them could react, she pressed it once. Click. A loud, piercing screech exploded through the garage. The noise was unbearable. It reverberated off the walls, a sharp, mechanical scream that echoed in every direction. The bikers recoiled instantly. Reese stumbled back, clutching his ears. The wiry one cursed loudly, doubling over. Scar's jaw tightened as he squinted through the deafening sound. Emily moved quickly. She reached into her bag on the passenger seat and pulled out something else, a sleek black baton. With a flick of her wrist, it extended with a sharp snap. The noise cut off as suddenly as it started. Silence swallowed the garage again, but the echo seemed to linger in the air. Reese staggered back a step, his hand still pressed to his ear. His face was twisted in a mix of confusion and anger. What the hell was that? Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. The baton hung loosely at her side, her grip relaxed but purposeful. The wiry man shook his head, glaring at her now, his earlier amusement gone. You think that little toy's gonna help you, lady? You've got no idea who you're messing with. Emily tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked on him. I could say the same to you. Scar watched her more carefully now. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't smiling. If anything, he looked cautious, like he'd suddenly realized there was something about Emily Walker that didn't add up. Reese recovered quickly, straightening his shoulders. His grin returned, though it was tighter this time. All right, sweetheart. You wanna play games? Fine. But you're not walking out of here so easily. He took another step toward her. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she turned the baton in her hand once, testing its weight. Her movements were practiced, fluid, like someone who'd done this before. Her eyes never left his face, calm and unblinking. Reese noticed. He paused, just for a second. What are you waiting for? The wiry man growled behind him. She's one woman. But Reese's confidence was starting to crack. He could see it now, something in the way she stood, the way she moved. This wasn't fear. This wasn't panic. This was control. Emily let the silence stretch for just a beat longer before she spoke again. You want to know what happens next? Reese frowned, his lips parting as though to answer. He didn't get the chance. Emily struck. The baton swung forward, fast and precise. Before Reese could react, the steel connected with his hand. Crack. He let out a pained shout as his knuckles crumpled under the impact, his grip on the situation slipping along with his balance. Emily pivoted smoothly, not giving the wiry man time to react. She spun the baton and struck again, this time aiming for his leg. It connected with the side of his knee hard. He buckled instantly, collapsing to the concrete with a strangled yell. Scar finally moved. He surged forward, faster than the others, his hands clenched into fists. Emily was ready. As he swung at her, she ducked, her movements sharp and calculated. She stepped to the side and used his momentum against him, jabbing the baton into his ribs. He grunted in pain, stumbling back, but he recovered quickly. Not bad, he muttered, his voice low. Emily tilted her head slightly, her grip tightening on the baton. I'm just getting started. Scar lunged again, but this time, Emily was faster. She sidestepped his attack and swept his legs out from under him with one clean motion. He hit the ground hard, the sound of his body smacking against the concrete echoing through the garage. Reese was still cradling his injured hand, staring at Emily like he'd seen a ghost. The wiry man groaned from where he lay on the floor, clutching his knee. Scar was breathing heavily, his jaw tight with frustration as he pushed himself back up onto his feet. Emily stood at the center of it all, calm, steady, and completely unfazed. "You," Reese muttered, his voice trembling with anger. "Who are you?" Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to. Instead, she let the baton collapse back into its compact form with another sharp snap and tucked it back into her bag. The silence stretched, broken only by the biker's ragged breathing. "I told you," she said quietly, her voice steady. "You had 3 seconds." Reese's face twisted in fury, but he didn't move. None of them did. They just stared at her, their earlier bravado shattered into a million pieces. Emily turned her back on them without hesitation. She opened her car door, slid inside, and pulled it shut. The engine hummed softly to life as she started it. For a moment, she sat there, watching them through the windshield. Reese's face was pale now, his hands still cradled against his chest. Scar was on his feet again, though he didn't approach her. His eyes were sharp, calculating, as he watched her drive past them. Emily didn't say another word. As she pulled out of the garage, her expression remained calm, unreadable. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over yet. Emily's car eased smoothly out of the garage, the low rumble of the engine trailing her like a quiet hum of victory. The fluorescent lights of the structure flickered above as she pulled up the ramp and into the night. The scene she'd left behind was etched into her mind, 3 men who had vastly underestimated her now lying winded and disoriented on the cold garage floor. But Emily knew better than to get comfortable. The encounter hadn't been the end, it was just the beginning. She glanced briefly in the rearview mirror. For now, the bikers were still back there, fading into the shadows of the parking garage. Reese was glaring daggers even as he cradled his hand, Scar's sharp gaze burned like a warning, and the wiry one, well, he wouldn't be getting up quickly with that knee. 3 seconds, she muttered under her breath, a faint smirk ghosting across her lips. The city unfolded before her, a sprawl of muted lights and darkened streets. It was late past midnight and traffic had thinned to a trickle. Emily merged onto the main road with a steady hand, her thoughts as controlled as her movements. She didn't allow herself to replay the scene too many times. That kind of reflection led to distraction. And distraction wasn't something she could afford. It hadn't started this way, of course. She hadn't walked into that parking garage looking for trouble. Emily had never been the type to invite it. In fact, if you asked anyone who knew her, they'd describe her as quiet, the kind of person who blended into the background. The type you'd overlook at a crowded cafe or in a meeting. But beneath that quiet exterior, something sharper lingered. Emily's day had been long. She had spent hours going through reports and holding conversations that felt routine and dull. All she had wanted was to grab her bag, make it to her car, and disappear into the calm of her apartment. It was meant to be one of those nights where nothing happened. And then she'd heard the first laugh. At the time, she hadn't turned around. She'd kept walking to her car, her keys already in hand, her focus narrowed to her exit. Her father used to call it the gray zone mindset, the way she locked out distractions when she needed to keep moving. But even then, her instincts had whispered that something wasn't right. It was a trickle of awareness at first, the feeling of being watched, the faint scrape of boots against concrete. When she'd reached her car, they'd been there, lounging like predators with too much time on their hands. She had spotted them from the corner of her eye, 3 bikers, all leather and confidence, looking at her like she was entertainment for the evening. Emily had pretended not to notice. She'd kept her breathing steady, her posture casual, as if they were invisible to her. Most people, she knew, didn't want to deal with strangers like that. Avoid eye contact, keep walking, don't provoke. That was what most people did. But Emily Walker wasn't most people. Emily's fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel as she pulled onto a quieter road. The clock on the dashboard read 12:47 a.m. The streets stretched empty before her, lit only by faint streetlights and the occasional flash of neon from distant signs. She didn't like driving this late, but tonight wasn't one of her normal nights. Something gnawed at her mind, an itch that wouldn't go away. She knew those men weren't finished with her. Men like Reese didn't let things go easily. Their pride wouldn't allow it. The way Scar had watched her still unsettled her the most. Quiet men were dangerous for one reason: they thought before they acted. And Emily was willing to bet they wouldn't leave her alone. Not after tonight. She pulled into her building's underground parking lot, killing the engine as soon as she slid into her spot. Her apartment wasn't far. Just a quick elevator ride to the 8th floor. Safe, sound, locked away. Except, as Emily stepped out of the car, she paused. Her ears perked up, and she turned her head slightly, listening. The underground garage was eerily silent, save for the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. But something felt off. She didn't ignore her instincts. Emily reached into her bag again, her fingers brushing against the baton she'd used earlier. She gripped it loosely, her body language still casual as she walked toward the elevator. If anyone were watching her, she knew better than to let them see fear. Fear gave away too much. The elevator door opened with a soft ding. Emily stepped inside, her thumb pressing the 8 button as she shifted her weight slightly. The door slid shut, and she felt a faint twinge of unease settle over her. What Emily didn't know was that Reese, Scar, and the wiry man who was called Tucker were already regrouping. Their pride was bruised, their bodies aching, but their tempers burned hotter than ever. "She's not walking away from this," Reese growled, his good hand curled into a fist. "Did you see her? Like she owned us." Tucker, still wincing as he leaned against his bike, spat on the ground. "No one does that to me. I'll make her pay for it." Scar didn't say much, but his sharp eyes darted back toward the garage exit, narrowing with thought. "She's not just some random woman," he muttered. Reese shot him a glare. "What's that supposed to mean?" "She knew what she was doing," Scar said flatly. "You don't move like that unless you've been trained." Reese rolled his eyes. "Oh, give me a break. She caught us off guard, that's all. She's probably just some self-defense class hero who thinks she's tough. We'll show her what real trouble looks like." Scar didn't argue, but his expression remained thoughtful. Something's not adding up here, he thought. And Scar, unlike the others, was smart enough to be cautious. When Emily finally made it inside her apartment, she double-locked the door behind her. The small, quiet space greeted her with familiar comfort. A cozy couch, shelves lined with books, and a faint hum from the heater. It was her sanctuary usually. Tonight, though, it didn't feel quite right. Emily stood still for a moment, listening. The city sounds outside were muffled and distant, like background noise. But the unease from earlier hadn't gone away. It curled in her stomach, a weight she couldn't shake. "They're not finished," she thought. "Men like that never are." She set her bag on the counter and pulled out her phone. No missed calls, no messages. For a split second, she considered dialing the police. Reporting the encounter might have been the logical choice. But Emily dismissed the thought just as quickly. She had spent too many years handling situations on her own. Relying on others, trusting them to intervene, had never worked for her in the past. People tended to underestimate trouble until it was staring them in the face. No, Emily knew she would have to deal with this herself. Quietly, she opened a drawer in the kitchen and pulled out a sleek black case. She set it on the counter and flipped it open. Inside lay a small but deadly collection of tools, compact, discreet, and capable of doing far more damage than they appeared. Emily ran her fingers over them thoughtfully. Her father's words echoed in her mind, always be prepared. The moment you let your guard down is the moment you lose. Her grip on the baton earlier had been steady because it wasn't the first time she'd held one. Nor would it be the last. Taking a deep breath, Emily closed the case and slid it back into its drawer. She didn't need to arm herself yet. But if those men came looking for her again, she'd be ready. Scar kicked at the ground, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. We need to figure out who she is. What for? Tucker scoffed. Let's just find her and get payback. Scar shook his head. You don't go swinging at people like that unless you know what you're up against. She's not scared of us. That tells me we're the ones at a disadvantage. Reese clenched his fists. I don't care who she is. Tomorrow, we find her. Scar frowned, but he didn't argue. They were too angry to think clearly. But Scar? He felt it in his gut. Emily Walker wasn't someone to underestimate. And that made her dangerous. The bikers found her the next evening. Emily wasn't surprised. She knew their pride wouldn't let them walk away quietly, not after what happened in the garage. And sure enough, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched long across the city, they came looking for her. This time, they were more prepared, or so they thought. It started as Emily walked through the quiet alley behind her apartment building. She was heading to her favorite little cafe just a block away, craving a cup of tea and a quiet evening alone. The alley was nothing unusual, dim, narrow, the hum of a nearby vent filling the silence. And then she heard it. The low rumble of motorcycle engines. Emily didn't flinch. She kept walking, her face calm and her movements steady, but her heart was already racing, not from fear, but from calculation. How many? She wondered. 3 bikes, maybe 4. Her ears picked up the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the pavement behind her. They weren't trying to hide. That cocky swagger was familiar now. They wanted her to hear them. To feel trapped. Emily stopped walking. She turned slowly, her eyes sweeping across the alley. And there they were. Reese stood front and center, his leather jacket open, the bruises on his knuckles from last night barely faded. Scar was there too, his cold, analytical stare fixed on her like he was still trying to figure her out. Behind them, Tucker leaned against his bike, sneering, his wiry frame twitching with anticipation. And there was one more, a bigger man she hadn't seen before. He was broad-shouldered and silent, his arms crossed over his chest, a scowl carved into his face. They'd brought reinforcements. Reese grinned, his teeth gleaming in the fading light. Well, sweetheart. Didn't think we'd see you again so soon. Emily didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze moving from one man to the next. She was reading them, assessing their weapons, their stance, their weaknesses. They didn't notice. They never did. Tucker stepped forward, his voice mocking. You think you're tough, huh? That little stunt last night? Lucky shot, that's all it was. Emily said nothing. Reese's grin faltered just a little. Not so chatty now, are you? Let's make something clear, sweetheart, you don't mess with people like us and walk away clean. See, we're going to teach you a lesson tonight. Scar didn't move, but his voice cut through the air. Who are you? He asked softly, his eyes narrowing. You don't fight like some regular person. You're trained, aren't you? For a split second, Emily held his gaze. And then she smiled, a small, sharp smile that made Scar's expression waver. Go ahead, she said quietly. Try me. Reese's laughter broke the tension. Oh, you're going to regret saying that. He motioned to the big guy. Show her why you don't mouth off to us, Dale. The man called Dale cracked his knuckles and stepped forward. He was massive, a walking wall of muscle. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Men like him used their size to intimidate. Emily didn't move. She just watched. And then he lunged. It happened so fast that Dale didn't understand what was happening until it was too late. The moment he swung at her, Emily sidestepped smooth, graceful, and impossibly fast. His fist cut through empty air, the momentum of his own attack pulling him forward. Emily moved in close, her smaller frame now inside his reach. She struck. One sharp jab to the ribs with the edge of her hand. Dale grunted, stumbling backward, clutching his side in confusion. What the? But Emily wasn't done. She spun behind him, her movements fluid and practiced, and swept her leg low. Before Dale could regain his balance, her foot caught him behind the knees. His legs buckled, and he hit the ground hard. The impact echoed in the narrow alley. Reese froze, his grin gone. Tucker's sneer faded into a look of disbelief. Scar didn't move. His eyes widened just slightly, like he'd just confirmed something he wished he hadn't. Dale groaned on the ground, struggling to push himself up. Emily stepped back, her stance still calm, her breathing even. She tilted her head. Is that all? The taunt wasn't loud. It wasn't cocky. But it hit them like a slap. Tucker snapped. You think you're funny, huh? He lunged at her, a knife flashing in his hand. Emily's expression didn't change. As Tucker came at her, the blade aiming for her side, she twisted. Her hand shot out and caught his wrist mid-air, stopping the knife in its tracks. Tucker's eyes widened in shock. Emily turned the wrist sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, and Tucker cried out as his arm twisted awkwardly. Emily shoved him back with a force that sent him sprawling into the wall. He hit the bricks with a thud and crumpled, groaning. The alley went silent. Scar's voice broke through, low and disbelieving. What are you? Emily finally looked at him. She stood straight, her shoulders relaxed, as if the two men on the ground didn't exist. Didn't anyone teach you to pick on someone your own size? Reese snarled. His face was red with rage now, his bravado cracking under the weight of what he was seeing. You think this is over, he spat. You're dead, lady. You hear me? You're. Emily moved before he finished his sentence. She closed the distance between them in a blink. Reese didn't even have time to swing at her before her hand shot forward, grabbing his collar. She yanked him off balance and spun him around, slamming him face first against the wall. Enough, she said quietly, her voice like steel. Reese struggled, but Emily's grip was iron. She leaned close, her voice cold and calm in his ear. You're going to walk away. You're not going to follow me. You're not going to look for me. Because if you do, I'll find you first. And you won't like it? Reese went still. For the first time, she could feel his fear. She let him go, stepping back as he turned to face her. His breath came in shallow gasps, his eyes darting between her and the two men still groaning on the ground. He looked like he wanted to say something, but no words came. Scar was the only one still standing. He hadn't moved, hadn't tried to stop her. He just watched her carefully, a strange mix of respect and wariness in his gaze. I get it now, he said softly. You're not just some woman. Emily didn't respond. She turned and walked away, leaving them there in the alley bruised, shaken, and utterly silent. The bikers had come looking for a victim. Instead, they'd found a ghost. As Emily stepped back onto the main street, she blended seamlessly into the crowd, just as she always did. Quiet. Unassuming. Invisible. But now, those men knew better. And as for Scar, the thoughtful one, he would remember this night for the rest of his life. Because he'd seen something in Emily that no one else had, a power that she carried in silence. For her, it was just another day. For them, It was the day they learned never to underestimate the quiet ones. The sound of her footsteps echoed faintly as Emily walked away from the alley, leaving the bikers to their silence and bruised pride. Each step she took felt deliberate, measured like a punctuation mark on the lesson she'd just delivered. The cool evening breeze rustled her coat, but Emily barely noticed. Her thoughts were clear, calm. Behind her, Scar finally moved. He crouched beside Reese, who still leaned against the brick wall, pale and shaken. Scar's gaze followed Emily's retreating figure until she disappeared into the night. What was that? Tucker groaned from where he sat slumped on the ground, still cradling his twisted wrist. Reese didn't answer. His lip was split, his pride more battered than his body. She's not normal, he muttered finally, his voice hollow. She's. Scar straightened, brushing off his jacket. She's trained, he said, almost to himself. His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't bitter, either. There was something else there, an edge of realization, of respect. She didn't fight like someone who learned a few tricks. That was discipline. Precision. She's dangerous. The big man Dale finally climbed to his feet, groaning as he rolled his shoulder. He shot Scar an incredulous look. You're telling me some woman half my size put me on the ground in 10 seconds flat because she's trained? What is she, a ninja or something? Scar's eyes remained fixed on the spot where Emily had vanished. Something like that. Reese spat blood to the side, pushing himself upright. His hands trembled, he'd never admit it, but the calm, effortless way Emily had handled them rattled him more than the bruises she'd left. We find out who she is, Reese said suddenly, his voice cracking with fury. No one does that to us. No one. Scar turned sharply, his expression hard. You really want to go looking for her again? Reese's face twisted into something bitter and defiant. I'm not letting some nobody make a fool out of me. Scar shook his head, a faint warning in his voice. I think you're not hearing me, Reese. She isn't some nobody. You felt it when she looked at you, when she moved. That wasn't luck. That wasn't a fluke. I don't know who she is, but I know this messing with her again would be the dumbest thing you've ever done. The alley fell silent again, the only sound the faint hum of passing traffic on the street beyond. Reese didn't reply. Meanwhile, Emily walked a quiet, winding path back to her apartment. The street lights flickered gently, casting pools of light across the sidewalk. She knew she was being watched. Those men might be licking their wounds, but someone like Reese wouldn't let this go easily. Emily sighed softly. She didn't want trouble. She hadn't wanted to fight them at all. But people like that didn't listen to words. They didn't back down unless someone gave them a reason to. And Emily? Well, she'd given them a reason tonight. When she reached the door to her apartment building, she paused for just a moment, glancing back down the street. For the first time in years, she wondered if her quiet, hidden life had just been compromised. I was careful, she thought. No one should know. But that Scar guy, he was smarter than the rest. He'd seen it. He'd understood. Emily shook off the thought and stepped inside, the soft hum of the building's lobby welcoming her back into her solitude. The next day dawned bright and crisp, the sunlight painting the city golden. Emily went about her routine like always. She slipped into her small, inconspicuous car, her face as calm and unreadable as ever. No one would have guessed what had happened the night before. She drove across town, blending into the morning traffic like a shadow. She passed coffee shops, stores, and offices brimming with ordinary people living ordinary lives. It was a life she'd always wanted, a quiet one. By the time she reached the edge of town, the industrial district was just beginning to wake up. Emily parked her car in front of a plain, unmarked building. The kind of place most people wouldn't notice. She checked the mirrors, no one had followed her. Stepping out, she walked inside. The building's interior was stark but well kept, a private training facility lined with mats, equipment, and walls padded for impact. It smelled faintly of sweat and discipline. "Emily," a deep voice called from the far end of the room. She turned and smiled faintly. Standing there was a tall, grizzled man with salt and pepper hair. His arms were crossed, but his sharp eyes appraised her like always searching, testing. "Good morning, Carter," Emily replied softly. Carter nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. "You're late." "Long night," she said simply, pulling her jacket off and revealing her training gear underneath. Black, clean, no frills. Just like her. Carter's brow furrowed slightly. "Something happened?" Emily hesitated, just for a second. Then she shook her head. "Nothing I couldn't handle." Carter didn't push. He knew Emily too well. If she wanted to talk, she would. If not, he wouldn't get a word out of her. Instead, he gestured toward the mats. "Warm up. You look stiff." Emily suppressed a small smile as she crossed to the center of the room. "Still think I'm out of practice, Carter?" He snorted. "No, Walker. But there's always someone faster. Stronger. Smarter. You keep sharp, or one day you'll meet them." Emily paused for just a moment, her movements fluid as she began stretching. Her mind flashed back to the alley, the look on Reese's face when she'd pinned him to the wall. The way Scar had stared at her, as if trying to see past the calm surface. Always someone faster. Emily straightened, rolling her shoulders. "I'll take my chances." That night, Reese sat slouched at a bar with a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. His hands still trembled when he thought about her. The alley. The ground rushing up at him. He couldn't let it go. Tucker slid into the seat beside him, his wrist wrapped in a brace. "You're sure about this?" he muttered, throwing a glance over his shoulder as if he expected Emily to walk through the door. Reese's eyes narrowed. "I need to know who she is. Where she learned to fight like that. Nobody just does what she did." Tucker looked skeptical. "Maybe she's a cop? A soldier?" Reese shook his head. "No. It's more than that. She wasn't just good. She was professional," Scar said, cutting in as he appeared behind them. He dropped into a seat opposite, his gaze sharp and thoughtful as always. "She's not a cop. She's not a soldier. She's something else. And if you go looking for her again, you better be ready." Reese bristled, glaring at Scar. "What are you saying?" Scar's voice was low and deadly serious. "I'm saying leave her alone. You don't want to know what someone like her can really do." Reese's hands curled into fists around his glass. "I don't take orders from you. Or her." Scar held his gaze for a long moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." With that, Scar stood and walked away, leaving Reese and Tucker in uneasy silence. "Who is she?" Reese muttered under his breath. "Who the hell is she?" But no matter how many times he asked, the answer wouldn't come. Emily Walker wasn't just some woman. And now, for better or worse, they knew it. The lights of the parking garage flickered overhead, casting long shadows that stretched across the cold concrete. Emily stood beside her car, the door still open, the sounds of distant footsteps approaching, signaling the arrival of security. She didn't move, didn't need to. The events that had just unfolded were still fresh in her mind, but she felt no need for triumph. No need for words. She had handled the situation. It was over. Behind her, the bikers remained scattered on the ground, nursing their wounds and trying to regain some shred of dignity. Their bravado, their cocky sneers, had evaporated. They were just men now, defeated, humiliated, and unsure of what had just happened. One of them, Reese, was the first to stir. He groaned as he pushed himself to sit up, glancing around. His eyes were wide with disbelief, a mix of fear and frustration painted across his face. But his body, battered and sore, gave him little comfort. It didn't matter how much he tried to shake it off, he would never forget the way she moved, the way she controlled them without breaking a sweat. Beside him, Tucker was still cradling his wrist, the pain from his injury clear in his eyes. He was the quiet one, usually the one who stayed out of trouble. But tonight, he had learned a painful lesson: some people are far more than they appear. Then, there was Scar. The largest of them all. The one who had been too confident, too sure that his size and strength made him untouchable. He looked up at Emily, his expression unreadable. But there was no mistaking the hint of respect in his gaze. The fear was still there, buried beneath the surface, but it was quickly followed by admiration. She had made them all realize something they had never considered: some people are not to be underestimated. And Emily Walker was one of those people. As the security officers arrived, they assessed the situation. The garage was eerily silent now, save for the low murmur of the bikers' groans and the steady hum of fluorescent lights. The officers moved in with practiced ease, clearly used to dealing with situations like this. They didn't even look at Emily. She wasn't the one they needed to question. "Everything okay here, ma'am?" one of the officers asked, his tone polite but professional. He gave her a quick glance but quickly turned his attention back to the group of bikers. Emily didn't answer right away. She simply nodded, her face calm, her posture relaxed. She didn't need to say anything more. She had already done what needed to be done. The officer nodded back, then moved to the bikers. "You guys need some help up?" he asked, his voice blunt, as if the question had already been answered by the sight of them groaning on the floor. None of the bikers responded immediately. They were too humiliated to speak. They exchanged looks, their pride shattered. Scar, the big one, was the first to rise, though it was clear he wasn't doing so out of any sense of authority. He was simply trying to avoid further embarrassment. The officer raised an eyebrow as he watched them struggle to their feet. "I'd suggest you all get moving," he said flatly. "You don't want to make this any worse for yourselves." Emily's eyes flicked over them once more. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't even angry anymore. The bikers had made their choice. They had crossed a line, and now they had to face the consequences. She had shown them who was in control, and now they would leave with nothing but bruises and broken egos. "Leave her alone next time," the officer added, glancing briefly at Emily before turning his attention back to the bikers. "And for your sake, I'd suggest you remember who you're dealing with next time you want to pick a fight." The bikers were silent, their faces a mix of anger and shame. They didn't argue. They didn't protest. They knew they couldn't. They had already lost. And now, the only thing left for them was to walk away with what little dignity they had left. One by one, they limped past the officers, their heads down, and headed toward the garage's exit. The sounds of their footsteps were muffled by the thick concrete walls, but the silence that followed their departure felt louder than anything. Emily stood still, her back straight, her eyes watching the bikers retreat into the night. The officers didn't approach her again. They didn't need to. They had seen what she was capable of. They had seen the power in her quiet strength. And that was enough. She took a deep breath, her body finally relaxing as the tension eased out of her muscles. She didn't look back as she slid into her car. She didn't need to. She had made her point. She had shown them who was in charge. For Emily, it was just another night. Another chapter in her life that no one would ever fully understand. She started the car, the engine rumbling to life beneath her. The world outside seemed unchanged. People were still walking the streets, going about their business, unaware of the events that had unfolded just moments ago. But Emily knew. She always knew. As Emily drove away from the garage, she could feel the weight of the night's events slowly fading from her mind. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel, her movements steady and practiced. She didn't need to rush. She didn't need to dwell. Some people believed that loud actions always made the biggest impact. They thought that to truly show your power, you had to make a scene, to shout and demand attention. But Emily had always known the truth. True power didn't need noise. It didn't need flashy gestures or grand speeches. It didn't need anyone else to validate it. True power was quiet. It was the ability to stay calm when everything around you was chaos. It was the ability to walk away with nothing but the knowledge that you had handled it. And for Emily, that was enough. The next day, the news spread like wildfire. The incident at the parking garage became a whisper in every corner of the city. No one knew the full story, but they all heard the rumors: the bikers who had picked the wrong fight. The quiet woman who had taken them down without breaking a sweat. Emily didn't care about the rumors. She didn't care about the whispers that followed her wherever she went. What mattered to her was the feeling of peace that settled over her when she woke up in the morning, knowing that she had done what she needed to do. No one had to tell her she was strong. No one had to remind her that she was in control. She already knew. And as for the bikers, they wouldn't forget Emily Walker. They would remember the quiet woman who had shattered their bravado and humbled them in ways they couldn't comprehend. They would remember how, in the end, it wasn't the loudest, biggest, or most intimidating person who had won. It was the one who knew exactly who she was and wasn't afraid to show it when it mattered most. And that, in the end, was the most powerful lesson of all. The night had passed, and the world outside was quiet again, just as it had been before Emily's encounter in the parking garage. Yet, something had changed, not in the world around her, but within the people who had witnessed her strength, her composure, and her silent power. For Emily, it had always been this way. She didn't seek recognition. She didn't crave attention. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. What she understood, what she had always known deep down, was that true strength wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about being loud or dominating the room with every word or movement. It was about the quiet moments. The ones when no one was looking. The moments when you had nothing to prove, but everything to show. And it was in those moments that Emily felt most alive. As she sat in her small, quiet apartment that night, staring out the window at the city below, her mind wandered back to the events of the previous evening. She could still feel the adrenaline, still hear the sounds of the bikers' shocked voices echoing in her ears. But more than that, she could feel something deeper. She had taught them all a lesson. A lesson that didn't require words or gestures. Just actions. The bikers, with all their arrogance, had learned that the strongest people don't need to wear their power on their sleeves. They don't need to make noise. They don't need to take up space. In fact, the quieter you are, the more you can observe. The more you can learn. And the more you can control the situation when it matters most. Emily had always believed in this. Ever since she was a child, she had seen how people overlooked the quiet ones, the ones who didn't shout for attention. The ones who blended into the background. But Emily knew the truth. The quietest people often held the most powerful secrets. The ones that no one ever saw coming. And it wasn't just about physical strength, or being able to handle a tough situation. It was about inner strength. It was about self-discipline, control, and knowing your worth, even when others didn't. That was what had made Emily different. She had always understood that strength wasn't just about standing tall when things were easy. It was about standing steady when everything around you was falling apart. It was about staying calm, even when everyone else was panicking. It was about knowing who you were, without needing anyone else to validate it. As she sat there in the dim light of her apartment, Emily couldn't help but think about the people who had underestimated her over the years. There had been so many people who thought she was too quiet, too reserved, too unassuming to be a threat. But they had all been wrong. Every single one of them. They had seen her silence and mistaken it for weakness. They had assumed she was just another face in the crowd, someone who didn't have the strength to stand up for herself. And maybe, for a time, they were right. Maybe she had let them believe it. She had learned to blend in, to stay unnoticed, to wait for the right moment. But now, the truth was clear. Silence, when used wisely, was a weapon. And that weapon was the one that had silenced the bikers. It was the one that had made them realize that not everyone who was quiet was weak. In fact, the quiet ones were often the ones you needed to watch the closest. Emily smiled softly to herself as she stood up from the chair and walked toward the window. She looked out at the city skyline, the lights of the buildings shimmering in the distance. She had spent so many years hiding in plain sight, letting people underestimate her, letting them believe whatever they wanted. But now, she knew something they didn't. She had learned to play the game without ever showing her hand. She had learned that in a world full of noise, sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was remain silent and wait for your moment. And when that moment came, Emily had shown them all what quiet strength really looked like. She had taught them all a lesson, one that, for many of them, would stay with them for the rest of their lives. A lesson that would echo in their minds whenever they thought about underestimating someone who appeared to be too quiet or too unremarkable. The truth was simple. It was never about the noise. It was never about who could shout the loudest. It was about who could stand their ground, remain composed, and take control when it really mattered. And for Emily, that was always the quietest person in the room. She walked away from that night without a single word of victory, without a need for recognition. Because, in the end, the ones who truly understand their power never need to boast about it. They simply let their actions speak for themselves. As the night passed and the city around her grew quieter, Emily thought back to the words that had echoed in her mind before the encounter even began. Never judge a book by its cover. It was a lesson she had learned long ago. And now, she had proven it to everyone who had ever doubted her. The quiet ones. They were the ones you needed to fear. And Emily Walker? She was living proof of that.